And we find that the more power the Constitution allocates to government during emergencies, so the more they can actually do, the more people die. And if government needed that power and used it productively, we would see the exact opposite.
Drastic times call for drastic measures, or so they say. Government emergency powers have become a hotly debated topic in the post-COVID age, where state actors were authorized to take unprecedented action in response to the outbreak of the disease. Constitutional limits on power were temporarily lifted so governments could take decisive action in imposing lockdowns and mask mandates. At the same time, governments took this extra freedom to persecute political enemies and will reward their friends while neglecting to solve the problem. As a result, one must ask about whether these emergency powers are worth the risk and how do we construct better structural limits on government. Joining us today is Chris Bjørnskov. He's a professor of economics and the president-elect of the Public Choice Society. He's the author of an award-winning paper on the historical use of emergency powers, where he concludes that they've had little if no benefit. We also cover his experience teaching and living in Scandinavia and what we can learn from their political and economic model. I hope you enjoy our discussion. Welcome to the AIER Standard. I'm Ethan Yang. Today I had the great opportunity of catching up with the new president-elect of the Public Choice Society, Chris Bjørnskov, who's also a professor of economics. Did I say that right?
Yeah, fine.
All right, thank you. Who's also a professor of economics at, Aarhus in Denmark? You actually just won an award today. If you want to tell us about that paper.
Oh yeah, I won the Dun & Black Prize. It's a paper with Stefan Vogt in Hamburg, whom I've known for almost since I was a PhD student. It's come out of a long project that we've had on about states of emergency, particularly constitutionalized states of emergency. And the paper, Emergencies on the Misuse of Government Powers, is something we started doing some years ago now, where we look at natural disasters. So the idea is that if you have a constitutionalized state of emergency, that is supposed to give government more powers to act quickly and decisively to avoid the worst consequences of, for example, natural disasters or invasions. And you would think that if those constitutional emergency provisions work as intended, fewer people will die where you have emergency provisions, and fewer people will die when you have provisions that allow governments to act faster and do more.
And okay, so your paper is about emergency powers and sort of, I guess, whether or not they work based on the constitutional limitations, the structural limits on power.
Exactly.
So before we actually get into that, so I guess I think most of our listeners can already kind of see what the major event is that we're thinking of, i.e., COVID lockdowns, emergency powers. But before we do all of that, I think it's very interesting because your paper, this is almost like a political science, legal, with some sort of economics tossed in sort of paper. But your background is actually in economics. So I was wondering, did you always have like this interest in economics, but also like a foot in the humanities and political science and the legal sector?
So my educational history is a bit weird because I started at journalism school straight out of high school and didn't like it at all. So I spent a year having fun and coaching swimming and started studying physics. And from there, I kind of drifted into economics because I had a couple of friends who were doing that, and I realized that was incredibly interesting. And well, during my master's time, I got more and more interested in development economics. And I don't think you can do that without also getting an interest in political economy or public choice and the intersection to political science. So when I got to writing my PhD, it ended up sort of halfway to political science. And with these kind of topics, emergencies, for example, there's also going to be a legal component to it. Which is how I joined forces with Stefan Vogt, who's specialized in law and economics.
So that's really interesting. And you said your affiliations are primarily in Northern Europe, Denmark, Sweden a little bit. Super interesting because I don't think many people really associate public choice, free market economics with I don't know if we know much about what's going on in Northern Europe. So I was wondering what from your experience, like how is it studying these sorts of topics or teaching it in your case in a place like that?
So we don't have corruption problems, for example. We have very limited corruption problems. The bureaucracy works extremely well. But if you're in Scandinavia, you are in a region of the world with huge government sectors that very often don't work well. The rest of society is very productive and nice and works. I mean, everything works very smoothly. But it's incredibly difficult to understand societies like Denmark, Norway, or Sweden, or Finland, for that matter, without a public choice angle, without an understanding of. So why do we have these massive government sectors? Why don't the health system? The health system doesn't work particularly well, and there's this ongoing discussion of how do we introduce reforms just to allow the welfare state in its current form to survive.
And so in America, there's a lot of like maybe you can call them myths, perhaps narratives about like Scandinavian quote unquote socialism. The happiest place on earth. The most of the money goes into welfare programs and everyone's happy and they don't that kind of stuff. Is it really? Before we get into your paper, are all these things that I'm just as an American kind of hearing in the discourse? What's sort of the reality on the ground?
The reality on the ground is that both the left and the right in American politics can claim Scandinavia as their own. So we have these very, very large government sectors. So the overall tax take in Denmark is 52% of GDP. My marginal tax rate right now is 56%. So if you look at that, if you look at redistribution, if you look at the structure of the health system, for example, which is fully government paid, you pay through the taxes, it looks very socialist. If you look at regulation, for example, or the protection of property rights, Denmark and Sweden look incredibly capitalist, and much more so than the US. So one thing that always strikes Americans as very odd when you think about the myths in the US about Scandinavia is that we don't have a minimum wage. Practically all labor market regulation is decided in negotiations between employers' organizations and labor unions. The government simply doesn't interfere. And it means that you have, on the one hand, what looks like a socialist government sector, and on the other hand, the rest of society is extremely capitalist.
So how exactly did that kind of turn out, right? So, I mean, it kind of makes sense. You have your productive economy so you can fund your welfare state. But how did they actually arrive at that model?
It arrives, so the labor market institutions are the result of really massive labor unrest in the late 1890s. And labor unions and employers' organizations sort of end up with a system of negotiations, formalized system of negotiations with also a dispute settlement system that it's finalized in like 1910. And by 1932, during the Great Depression, the Danish parties in Parliament decide that we're going to have some of the beginnings of a welfare state, a public pension system, for example. And that's what the Social Democratic Party gets. The right-wing parties get the promise that government is not going to interfere in private business at all. And since 1932, all parties in Parliament basically have accepted that deal.
And do you think that's sort of exportable, or do you think that's sort of it worked for a little bit, but it's honestly unsustainable?
I think the big problem is that we don't really know whether it's sustainable because there is a massive pressure on the welfare state. And it doesn't really give people strong incentives to work hard. So it is a system that gets consistently more expensive every year. But it also means that you can't really have that kind of system without allowing the rest of society to be extremely capitalist, because it's the only way you can make the private sector so productive that it can fund a welfare state. And there have been discussions for the last 35 years about reforms. By and large, Danish and Swedish politicians have kept up with reforms, trying to make things work. Sweden, for example, has a voucher system in the primary school system. You can go wherever you want.
And some people point to, I guess, ethnic homogeneity as one of the reasons why the welfare state is politically feasible. Like here in the U.S., we have a lot of debates about the welfare state, particularly along, I guess, racial ethnic lines. So do you think the sort of, Denmark is for Danish people, Sweden is for Swedish people, does that have any sort of effect on the political sustainability of the welfare state?
I don't think so. No, I think it's to do with a deeper cultural factor. Is that Denmark, Norway, and Sweden are the most trusting places in the world. Funny enough, outside of Scandinavia, one of the most trusting places in the world is North Dakota.
Interesting.
Where I think it's about 40% of all families can trace their family history back to Scandinavia. But that kind of trust culture makes things work. It's one of the reasons why we have so little corruption. People don't take bribes and don't offer bribes when they expect everyone else to do the right thing. And if people offer you a bribe, the reactions from the rest of society are very, very hard. You just don't. You say no, but in Greece you might say no. In Denmark you say no, and you report it to the police. But that kind of trust culture actually means that the welfare state is protected against a lot of fraud that you would see other places. And we see other places in the world where they try to introduce welfare state policies. It also means that the bureaucracy is clean and very, very effective. And it means that you can actually collect taxes without a lot of tax evasion. So it's possible to fund the system. Finally, it also seems to me that most people are willing to redistribute to other people they don't know, because they expect people to be trustworthy, and not to try to get benefits from the government that they don't need. But it all rests on that sort of bedrock of very high trust, which means that you might be able to export it to some places in the world, but other places in the world would just be impossible.
That's actually quite interesting in a sense that, especially, I guess, more since we're at a public choice conference, a lot of attention is typically given to interest group politics, structure, and you're just saying that might be a cause of, that might be causal, that might be important, but culture really does influence here.
I think culture does influence things here, and it also means that there's not one size that fits all. So you have to fit your institution to the culture that you're embedded in.
And I guess sort of slowly pivoting to your research and to current events, many people looked at Sweden as sort of the proof that lockdowns weren't necessary. Sweden had a different approach to the pandemic. Do you think any of that has anything to do with Scandinavian culture, or is there something else at play?
I think the Swedish approach to it was based on trust. So Anders Tegnell, who was the state epidemiologist, literally said that no, you can trust Swedes to behave properly here, not to take too many risks with elderly people and so on. You can expect people to do the right thing. We don't need government intervention at all. And a number of Danish epidemiologists supported that kind of system too, but the Danish government didn't.
And so when it comes, my memory of the COVID lockdown policies is sort of fading. So did Sweden did they stay open the entire time? Were there any sort of restrictions at play?
There were a few restrictions on high schools, but most of it was just based on recommendations. There was no mask mandate. The primary schools didn't close down. I was in Sweden in, when I said September, October 2021. Everything seemed normal in Stockholm. You went to a restaurant and had a nice meal, and nothing seemed out of order. everything looked normal. And at the same time, Germany, to the south of Denmark, was completely locked down.
And then I believe was Denmark and Norway also embraced lockdowns, if I'm not mistaken. Was
to some extent, yeah. Not as hard as Germany or New York, for example, California. But we did have lockdowns. They were lifted earlier than most of the places, and they were not popular in the population.
So I guess jumping into your research, I believe you mentioned one about emergency powers, i.e. the essentially what allows countries to enact a lockdown. And you talked about it. You have one paper that's emergency powers throughout history. And you also, I believe you also have another paper on emergency powers in the COVID context specifically.
Yes.
Okay. So I guess very briefly, what did your research on the COVID lockdowns demonstrate?
So we had already written the other paper on emergent powers during natural disasters, and then COVID happened, and we decided to have a look at so what happens now with COVID. Do the same constitutional provisions actually affect government responses? First thing is we could easily document massive misuse. So within like a few months in the spring of 2020, more than 25% of the world's democracies had violated the freedom of the press, arrested journalists and so on, which they were not allowed to do, even if they had declared a state of emergency. We could also see that I think it's by May the 10th, 99 countries in the world had declared a state of emergency. We don't have any examples anywhere in history of so many countries being in a state of emergency at the same time. So we could follow what they did. We could follow how quickly they went into lockdown. And funny enough, it didn't actually depend on how easy it was to declare a state of emergency. But the more power the Constitution gave politicians during an emergency, the quicker they declare one. It was about the power to government, not about anything else.
So I guess to simplify that, the general assumption is that we need emergency powers because sometimes we need to take quick aggressive action. Sometimes our constitutional limits on power and perhaps even our rights could be impediments to that. And perhaps it might be a good idea to give a short timeline to do whatever needs to be done. And that's sort of like a general assumption. And then what your research is showing is that politicians won't just use that power to do exactly what needs to be done and then call it a day. They're going to do it. They're going to use that power to basically do whatever they feel like doing.
Oh yeah. So in the paper that we get the Duncan Black Prize for, which is just basic on natural disasters since 1990, what we do is we look at these natural disasters and how many people die relative to how many people are affected. So you say it's more or less the same size of a natural disaster, and then we're looking at the relative deaths. We find that the more power the Constitution allocates to government during emergencies, so the more they can actually do, the more people die. And if government needed that power and used it productively, we would see the exact opposite.
And so what are some of these, because obviously maybe some people might say, correlation is not causation. So what are some of the case studies that say, okay, not only do we have a correlation, but we have evidence that the government's using this for very unproductive causes?
Well, the U.S. is sometimes a good example. So you have to declare emergency to get FEMA aid. But if you look at Louisiana, for example, they've had floods and hurricanes hit the state for, the last 200 years. And they still can't manage to maintain the dikes around Louisiana, around New Orleans. So they get FEMA aid, they get money from the federal government in order to be able to cope with hurricanes and floods, in order to actually build and maintain dikes. And that money somehow ends up somewhere else.
So
So we saw that when Katrina hit in 2005, that the dikes just broke down very, very quickly because no one had bothered to maintain them.
And you even mentioned in other countries, the governments would go as far as to just attack journalists.
Yeah. I was really, really surprised that even it happened in London, where police tried to shut down a number of journalists. Very briefly in Melbourne, Australia, police banned drones in the city centre on a day where there were massive demonstrations against the lockdowns. Fortunately, the courts in Australia quickly told the police, you're not allowed to do this. You have to stop. But there were these attempts at from governments and from police side to try to control whatever information came out of the media.
And so what you're saying is, of course, maybe politicians will use their emergency powers to address the pandemic, address the natural disaster. And I guess the incentive to do that is just because, if they don't do that, they'll be kicked out of office. But there's also an incentive to go after people they don't like, political dissidents, perhaps. Maybe, I believe in some countries, I forgot, I don't have the data on me right now, but I know in countries that are, less developed democracies, more of these sort of quasi, like electoral autocracies, maybe countries with less robust institutions, they just used it to solidify power for the next, decade or so.
That certainly happened in South Africa, for example, where the government blatantly misused power and where there are now lots of media stories about how some of the provisions just ended up in corruption, funding swimming pools and so on. But it is not just Hungary or South Africa or Brazil where this happened. It happened in Northern Europe too. And one of the big problems here is not just that you divert resources to other purposes. It's also that politicians have an incentive to be seen doing something. And the more the Constitution allows them to do, the more they're going to seize that opportunity because it's going to look great in the next election. So it's what we call action bias, that they would much rather do something that's just completely wrong than not do anything and be invisible in the media.
And that's, I guess, sort of what Andrew Cuomo did in New York.
Yes.
Yeah, he was basically a superstar, and then completely out of the picture for I think it was like there's like the sexual assault scandal, I think that really, but he was like, the Democrats' top person for his COVID policies, and obviously something happened, and all of a sudden he was off the national.
In Denmark, we had this journalist actually made fun of that. That at the beginning of the lockdowns, the Prime Minister chaired a lot of press meetings and was obviously in charge. And then when some of the bad stories started to occur with misuse of government powers and very, very stupid decisions, suddenly it was the Minister of Health who directed those press meetings, and the Prime Minister was nowhere to be found. So one example was the scandal around mink. So Denmark used to have a very large production of mink. And in late October 2020, there were rumors that mink might actually be able to transmit COVID. And government decided, we're just going to kill them.
Yeah, I remember that.
Which turned out to be completely unconstitutional. But they didn't bother with that because they said, we're in an emergency, so we can do whatever we want. Which obviously they can't, but they did.
So did your paper, specifically about COVID, did you explore the correlation between the use of emergency powers and caseloads, deaths, that kind of stuff? Were you able to see the similar causal correlation that you did with the natural disaster paper?
We could do a bit less there, but what we could do was also look at the aftermath of disasters. And it turns out that in the aftermath of disasters, one of the common reactions is that you get more market regulation. So once the disaster is over, some of this regulation and the emergency provisions sort of linger in the sense that you start to regulate markets and you don't deregulate again.
That's I'm assuming because it's the regulations are sticky. It's easier to put the regulations in place and take them out because I'm assuming the government wants to just call it safe, and perhaps they enjoy the power that comes out of that.
That plus a classic public choice explanation is that once you have these regulations, special interests form around them. The furlough schemes in Britain and in Denmark were great examples that you try to support some sectors of the economy when you lock down. But once you then start to open up society again, it gets very, very difficult to stop subsidizing those sectors because you know that some of them should have died. In a normal churning market economy, some of those companies go bankrupt. That's always the case. And you prevent those bankrupts while you have locked down society, while you have a disaster. And they are now suddenly special interests that do not want to stop those subsidies.
So when it comes to looking forward and using emergency powers, I'm sure that a lot of people would say, okay, I've heard what you have to say. Definitely checks out. We don't want to give too much emergency powers and too much discretion to politicians because they'll abuse it. Is there a way to balance, or I guess would you say that, one, are they necessary at all? And then two, if they are necessary, is there a way to balance the competing interest of the need to take action with the need to constrain leaders?
I mean, we haven't found when we look at natural disasters, we haven't found any good effects. We have looked at terrorist attacks, and that's a different ballgame, totally. So it seems as if sort of more permissive emergency provisions disincentivize terrorists from performing attacks. So in that sense, when you look at what we'd kind of call man-made disasters, we have an entirely different situation. And I think it's basically to do with the fact that some of these emergency powers can prevent certain disasters from happening. But of course, they can't prevent natural disasters from happening. So in that respect, it's completely irrelevant. But they do seem to work to some extent against terrorist attacks. And when looking at terrorist attacks, you can then talk about a trade-off between trying to prevent terrorist attacks by giving government more powers in an emergency versus the fact that we know that it tends to lead to more regulation, more repression, and so on in most societies, including a lot of democracies. There is a political trade-off there.
And that's sort of the ratchet effect of you give up some of your rights so that this was very apparent after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, where we gave up a lot of our privacy rights, of course, and then lo and behold, a lot of those the secret court systems that were used to expedite prosecutions and the Patriot Act, many of these provisions are still with us today. So that's and obviously we can go back and forth on whether or not it was necessary. How many terrorists have we stopped? That's certainly a conversation. But that is very interesting, though, on natural disasters, i.e. COVID, flood, fires, name another disaster. These emergency powers, I guess, from what I'm hearing from you, is that they were useless.
They were useless, We don't see any evidence that they saved any. It's basically the same with COVID, that the lockdown seems to have not led to fewer deaths. Then they may have led to lingering deaths now because we didn't save anyone from getting COVID or dying from COVID. But in many countries, we now have a massive backlog of cancer patients who didn't get treatment. And I think we do see the same with a number of other disasters that they don't really work in that particular moment, but there can be lingering effects that, well, for example, the special courts. Once they're there, the political system will think that they're nice because they get things done, so we don't want to get rid of them again. It's a bit like rationing after World War II. I think, as far as I remember, Norway got rid of the last rationing in 1956, 11 years after the war, because it was just a convenient way of government to try to control parts of the economy.
And that also happened in the U.S. following World War II. There's this whole controversy about seizing steel mills during the Korean War, and essentially, the idea was, we nationalized industry during World War II. Like, why can't we do it again? And there's nothing in the Constitution. Well, there's everything in the Constitution says you can't do this, but war is war. We need these powers, and look, we did it before. Let's do it again. Luckily, that was stopped by the Supreme Court. But that was, I guess, on that note, have you observed any lingering effects from the COVID lockdowns? Those sorts of the emergency powers used during COVID. Do you see any lingering institutional effects after?
It's a little early to say whether there are lingering effects, but there's certainly a sense that both in Parliament, among politicians, but also sometimes among policemen and certain authorities, they would like to continue to have surveillance powers that they got used to during COVID. And there were attempts in Europe, for example, to introduce a vaccine mandate across the entire EU, which was the EU's way of introducing ID cards in the entire union. It would be a sort of so we don't have ID cards at EU level. I think 25 of the 27 member states have IDs, but they're national. And the EU has, for a very long time, wanted to get an EU identity card and an attached EU citizenship. And for some time, there was this idea that, well, the vaccine card will be a way to get ID cards. That was fortunately stopped.
But what I'm hearing is that whatever doctrines or ideas that were introduced in the COVID era in the theme of emergency powers has since been adapted to, basically everything else. I do remember right after COVID was starting to winding down, the chattering class, the journalists started the word emergency just started popping up more and more. Like now we have a climate emergency, we have name a thing that's political, that political idea is now an emergency, and therefore, so it's certainly an interesting carry-on effect from that. From your research, particularly when it comes to the United States, what do you think were some of the most egregious uses of emergency powers that you've documented?
It's difficult with the US because you have 50 different states, so it's like a microcosm of the world. But I think one of the worst is the evolving scandal around Twitter. That it really appears that the federal government tried to get Twitter to censor certain people like Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford, Scott Atlas too, who actually was advisor to the president. It appears that the British government might have done the same thing. So about 100,000 WhatsApp messages have been released from the Minister of Health. And you can follow day-to-day politics in his WhatsApp messages. And there are even serious discussion in those messages of trying to see if they can send an opposition politician to jail, breaking COVID rules, but it would be great to send him to jail because once that happens, he might not be able to run for parliament again. You see those discussions around Matt Hancock, the British minister, and his advisors there, that, well, we're in this situation now, so we can actually do what we want. And the big problem is, of course, that if they get away with it, there's no one who are going to be able to guess what they're going to do next time. So you're right that on the far left in Europe, people have talked about using lockdowns to combat what they call the climate crisis instead. And it's again that slippery slope that we have used government powers for something which turned out not to work, but we can do it again for other purposes that might have nothing to do with crisis.
And then from a public choice angle, I'm assuming all this is essentially highlighting that government agents are first and foremost self-interested, and you give them the power, they'll use the power, they like the power. It's COVID is not any different. I think because I remember there's this huge narrative. This COVID is different, right? This is so different. That's why our principles don't apply. No. Like climate change is just name something. It's just so different, right? And I'm assuming that's just always. But your research is just showing, no, it doesn't matter if it's a earthquake, a fire, disease. These principles of limited government matter all the time.
They do, and no matter what kind of emergency it is, it opens the window of opportunity for politicians to take more power and then maintain it after the emergency is over. Mm-hmm. I mean, you could say that it's a situation where the menu of policy choices suddenly expands for a short while. And of course, politicians are then going to try out the new policy choices to see if they can get away with that.
And so I guess from your research, especially the English example, it seems like in what we like to call, very developed liberal democracies, when you sort of open up those boundaries these very strict boundaries that we've labeled constitutional limits and what have you, when you remove them, they're not unlike any other politician from a country with less protections on civil liberties and civil rights.
Exactly. I mean, once they're allowed to do things, they behave just like Russian or South African or Nicaraguan politicians. And the fun thing is that Matt Hancock, where we got the WhatsApp message from, he was considered just a normal politician in Britain.
And then we have, I guess, our version, Anthony Fauci. I'm sure the name's been hollered about 1,000 times already. But AIER, me and Phil Magnus actually were the ones that obtained the emails showing that he was essentially asking for a coordinated political takedown of the Great Barrington Declaration. And Anthony Fauci's not even technically a politician. He's like a doctor who happens to be in the government. So I guess if it happens in South Africa, it can happen here, just as long as, once our limits on power start to mirror South Africa, lo and behold, people in power behave like just any other country.
The whole COVID debate has shown that politicians are politicians no matter where they are. It's a system that defines what they're doing. It's not that they're nicer in Britain or the US than in Russia.
And I guess to tie it back to our initial conversation, do you think, you talked about how trusting Scandinavians are. Do you think at all, did you observe any sort of difference on that end between maybe some cultures are a little bit more trusting, therefore when you remove the boundaries, they're at least a little nicer than others?
I think what you can see in general, but also in during COVID, is that in high trust cultures, people, first of all, are more likely to just do what they're told. They follow rules that they think those rules might apply to them, and they make sense, so they follow them. But the other side of the coin is that in those kinds of cultures, when politicians are discovered to do something wrong, people react much harsher than in low trust cultures. So they're more trusting, but betrayal is punished much, much harder in a country like Denmark, Norway, Sweden.
So in a way, that's almost like a non-governmental restraint on power.
It's a non-governmental restraint on power that politicians know. They know that they can get away with much less in Sweden than in Greece. And basically, even though the politicians are better in Denmark than in Greece, they realize that voters are going to behave differently. And that restricts what they're allowed to do effectively.
So perhaps in the absence, let's say I'm sure the main implication of your research would be, we need better substantive limits on emergency powers. I'm sure that's a very obvious conclusion. But perhaps what you just said might even suggest, if you can't get these substantive reforms, perhaps the people themselves should, be a little bit more hostile when someone breaks the rules like that. Maybe use the press to name and shame politicians.
Oh yeah, what we need is what James Buchanan once. He categorized public choice as politics without romance. I think that's what we need in this situation.
Yeah, that's certain. Yeah, I've actually never thought of that, so I thank you for bringing that up right now. So it's like, yeah, I was wondering, like, okay, like I highly doubt we're gonna get much of these reforms passed, just because I'm assuming a lot of politicians would be opposed to it. So in the absence of that, perhaps just normal people, the civil society can create penalties of its own, like shaming, coordinated, just coordinated, like just bringing up how like abuses of power are happening, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that plus one thing that's quite common in at least Denmark, Norway, and Iceland, so the western half of Scandinavia. That if people simply don't see the point of rules, they're going to ignore them. And make sure that we figure something out around the rules instead. So these highly law-abiding countries do have these particular situations where people realize, well, the rules don't really work, so we're going to figure out something else. And they're simply going to ignore politics in that situation.
And is there like a strong watchdog culture in Scandinavia? Are there like lots of civil society groups that will actively coordinate, I guess, like shaming campaigns, or perhaps do these investigations on their own?
Well, there are civil society groups in many different fields, but it's mostly the media that does that. And I think the good thing about the Scandinavia is that it's a very direct culture. So sometimes people from the outside see Denmark and Iceland and Norway as very impolite countries. But it's basically because the culture is that if something's wrong, you're going to say it outright and very, very publicly. And that actually makes things work.
So I guess this press in Scandinavia seems like is a bit more independent. If the government says something wrong, they're going to call it out. Whereas in the U.S., a lot of the press is pretty pro. Obviously, I don't want to get too into it. Maybe showing my own biases, but many people in America complain that the vast majority of the press is left leaning. So if there's a Democratic administration, everything's all you're going to see on CNN is like everything's fine, right? And then you have Fox News for the Republicans. So it seems like all the press tends to be quite partisan.
We did have a period where the press didn't really challenge the government. But the press itself has taken that up and now depicts that as a period where they failed. And it's not a press that's so ideologically divided as in the US, which basically means that normally right-wing newspapers are likely to attack right-wing politicians. Again, because that is what they do. That's their raison d'être, as you say in French, right?
So and I guess I would assume in America, with the exception of a few news outlets, for the vast majority of the free press, they were not doing their jobs in terms of calling out what is bad policy or bad behavior. And I guess you're seeing a little bit now, like they're doing a little bit of retroactive, and by the way, lockdowns were bad, and right? But yeah, I guess that is remains to be seen question of whether or not our press will ever recover to. And I think the trends don't seem to be very good at the moment. But that's certainly interesting and encouraging to see that the Scandinavian press does have that sort of. I guess you can say backbone, right? I don't want to.
It's also there's one other thing that makes Scandinavian countries and Britain different from the US. It is that you have an elected head of state. We have monarchies, so our head of state is a hereditary monarch, which basically means that they have a completely they don't have any actual power. It all rests with the head of government. But the worst thing that can happen to a Danish politician is that the Queen says, "Oh, we think this is a bad idea," because she's been there since 1972. She knows her son is going to inherit the throne. So she has a very, very strong incentive to behave in what she perceives the right way in order to protect her own position and her family's position in the country. So you basically have a completely independent arbiter of politics, and most politicians know that. So they are a little careful about what they do, because there is this independent authority in the political system who might just once in a while say, we think things have gone too far.
And so I'm assuming what that does is it creates universal right and wrong, whereas in the country like the US, if you criticize the government, you're typically just seen as the partisan opposition.
Yeah.
And it's kind of impossible to really all settle on what is right and wrong. It's just like, I like the government if it's my side, I don't like if it's not.
Yeah, I mean, the system was intended to have a president who sort of was above everyday politics, but de facto, of course, you have a president that's only backed by half of the population. We have a monarch who's outside of that entire discussion.
So I guess to wrap up what's been a very interesting interview, what are some key takeaways do you think that we should have going forward after the experience of COVID, the emergency powers, and especially after your research?
I think the main takeaway is that there are things that government simply can't do anything about. It's not that they did things it's not just that they failed. They tried to do something that is logically impossible for government to do. That's control the respiratory virus. So I think the main takeaway for me is that we've been reminded that there are things that government just cannot do, even in the richest, most well-functioning societies in the world.
Chris Bjørnskov, professor of economics and the president-elect of the Public Choice Society. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Chris, if you want to give a quick shout out to PCS and what our viewers can maybe access from your resources.
Right, the PCS is the Public Choice Society. It's a more than 6-year-old organization that is here to make the case for political economy and public choice and that way of understanding politics and the world. We have a website where you can see what we do. There's a journal called Public Choice, where it's a leading field journal in the field with most major names published in Public Choice. Otherwise, it's very, very easy to find both me and my colleagues online on SSRED, for example.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today.